Yes, Mr. Commissioner. It's Chris Harvey for the Area G Trollers and the UFAWU. Gentlemen, I found... Big pardon? 10 minutes. 3 of us have to get done before noon, so I'll be racing. Gentlemen, I found your evidence quite troubling in 2 respects. One, in the manner in which the information you've brought to us seems to undermine the validity of the science that we're dealing with here, statistics. And the other, the way in which it undermines the rule of law. I'll deal first with the question of science. It's these fish illegally harvested that you mentioned, and the large numbers of them, are of course important.
I'm sorry to interrupt, my friend. I don't recall the evidence of large numbers of illegally harvested. I believe the witnesses were speaking with a sales issue as opposed to a harvest issue.
The million odd fish at one point and the less than a million now, are those illegally harvested or illegally sold?
What million fish are we talking here?
Well, the illegal sales, the large organized criminal activity with respect to illegal sales.
I'm sorry, the number?
Well, have I categorized it wrongly as illegally caught? Or can you separate it at all?
We have talked a lot about illegal sale of legally caught fish in the Aboriginal fishery. As far as illegal numbers of fish, or numbers of fish that are related to the catch information we have, we've talked about that, but I don't think we've come up with a number on illegal harvest. That it's virtually impossible to do, and if we knew what was caught illegally, we'd be catching them.
You've given evidence of inaccurate monitoring.
Yes.
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 And I think you said in response to questions about the Williams recommendation that the CNP assessments be incorporated into the numbers, into
yes.
the statistical basis.
Yes.
I think you said, in effect, that some fishery resource managers do not appear to be interested in doing that, or saying it doesn't fit their model or whatever.
A combination of those.
All right. So where are those fish going? We've heard in other panels that there's a large loss of fish between Mission Bridge and the spawning grounds. It's been categorized as DBEs. Would some of that be the
if there are inaccuracies in catch information, that would be a place where some fish would not be accounted for in our system.
Yes. Is it part of your recommendations, or would you recommend that the CNP branch be involved in estimating the numbers of fish harvested?
I think it's important that we get involved with funding to do some kind of a audit that is incorporated into whatever system and model that they have.
Yes, thank you.
So that we're basically testing. We're monitoring the monitors, for lack of better words, and taking a sample to determine the validity of those catches.
Yeah. Now, with respect to illegal sales, I've just been reviewing quickly some of the previous reports and previous testimonies, cases which you'd be familiar with, no doubt. In 2000, 3 truckloads of FSC fish stopped at the U.S. border. Do you recall that case? Charges laid and a conviction, I think.
Scott?
Yes.
Yes. Another case in which there was a conviction for $400,000 worth of FSC fish involving Lower Fraser First Nations, sold to a broker in North Vancouver.
Was that the canned product?
I'm not sure. There was.
I need to know what the actual case was.
All right. There may be more than one. At any rate, I think you've given sufficient evidence for this commission to determine that it's a significant magnitude. I want to determine, just for a moment, whether it's a question of insufficient funding or a question of inadequate legislation. At one time, FSC fish was marked with the snout and dorsal fin removed, and also there was an offense of a non-Aboriginal person possessing such FSC fish, correct?
That's correct.
The finding of unconstitutionality, I will suggest, related to removing the snout and dorsal fin. It didn't relate to a non-Aboriginal possessing FSC fish. Do you know?
I'm not sure.
All right. But at any rate, now, in order to get a conviction, you have to prove continuity from the time of catch to the time of sale.
It's one of the issues, yes.
That's virtually impossible to do now, isn't it? In that there's no regulation of transportation, no regulation of storage, no regulation of processing.
It's difficult to do, but as I stated yesterday, I think working with some regulations on storage is certainly one place that we could focus on, working with the province.
Yes, but isn't it critically important, if you're going to be able to deal with this large-scale illegal activity, organized illegal activity, it's essential that you be given the legislative tools to do your job.
As much as possible. It's also imperative that we get funding to do it, and it's also imperative that we continue not just to focus on the major case and the major investigation,
yes,
but working with the communities and the Pillar 1 activities that we talked about yesterday, and building the relationships with all user groups to try and change the attitudes or the acceptance of illegally fishing.
Yes.
Because until we do that, we'll be chasing a long time.
Am I right in thinking that at present there's no limit on possession, no limit of numbers on possession of FSC fish?
For an individual person?
Yes.
No.
And there's no traceability requirement, in the sense no tags have to be affixed to the fish.
That's correct.
Would you would you prepare to recommend to this commission that there be some legislative changes in order to incorporate some system of identifying FSC fish?
I would like to see some form of, I don't know if I would say marking is the answer, but it's whatever we do, it has to be able to differentiate between all user groups, whether it be rec, commercial, and First Nations. How that's achieved, as Scott mentioned, perhaps we know we could implement marking of some sort in the recreation and commercial fishery. I'm not so sure we can legally or force that in the Aboriginal fishery.
Yes. In my clients in the West Coast affix a chip to every single Chinook salmon that they catch, such that it can be identified right back to the fisherman who caught it in any restaurant around the world.
Sorry, and where was that?
That's on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They simply affix a chip to the fish.
Yep.
Some sort of tagging system like that for all commercial and all recreational fish would go a long way to assist you in getting a handle on these illegal sales you mentioned. Would it
Oh,
not?
absolutely.
Yes. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
J.K. Lowe's for the BC Wildlife Federation and the BC Federation of Drift Fishers. Time estimate about 3 minutes, Mr. Commissioner. I have a couple of questions on what was called Pillar 1. I take it Pillar 1 of your regime is really going out into the community and either giving rise to or either fostering or supporting what was called the conservation ethic. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
And I notice a CNP presence at all of the annual general meetings of the BC Wildlife Federation. That's a group which assists you in establishing your Pillar 1 goals?
Yes, in fact, they actively participate in one of them, and that's the rewards program.
Yes.
Yes.
And they effectively carry your message?
In my experience, yes.
Yeah, those are my questions.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Kultish. I will endeavor to be done by noon, and thank Mr. Lowe's for his quick questions. My name is Judah Harrison, for the record, and I am representing the Conservation Coalition, which is a group of non-governmental organizations, and Mr. Otto Langer. This question is for both of you, Mr. Kultish and Mr. Nelson. We've been speaking about various enforcement tools, and I've heard mentioned, boots on the ground and random audits. Those two tools, are they essential to effective enforcement in your view?
Yes.
Mr. Kultish?
Yes, absolutely.
And Mr. Nelson, yesterday I saw in the transcript, and also last time you were here, that you referenced a drop in habitat enforcement and said this was and we have confirmation of this in Exhibits 875, 876, and 877. And you said that this was a result of the EPMP program as well as directions from senior management. Is this correct?
Yes.
My question is, have you received additional directions from senior management to either focus or not focus on certain enforcement issues?
Not that I can think of.
Mr. Kultish?
I mean, we have a system to set of priorities, but nothing I've seen that says, no, you shouldn't be working on that. Okay. And with the EPMP, it didn't say we shouldn't do habitat. It said we're going to do it, take a different approach, and fishery officers aren't going to do it as much anymore. It's going to be through other means, operational statements, et cetera, et cetera.
There have been times where, as a result of direction or influence from out of Ottawa or senior levels in the Pacific region, where our activities have been influenced, and that would be either one to pay attention or apply added enforcement presence or attention to certain areas, and at the same time in at least one circumstances that I'm aware of in the last couple of years where we were told to not apply our I think the term was hold your nose.
So am I correct that holding your nose or not applying efforts is with respect to the enforcement of habitat violations?
It wasn't habitat. It was fisheries activity, but no, not habitat, no.
Can you potentially clarify what that activity was?
It was involving negotiations that were occurring with the SOMAS, First Nations in the SOMAS area, Howsett and the Nechalnath area, and that area historically has been a difficult area for enforcement compliance because of the challenges that departments had with coming up with agreements. And in this particular case, because the negotiations were ongoing, they felt that a strong presence in dealing with sales and others was probably not the best if we were going to reach an agreement, and hence we were asked to limit our presence.
Okay, thank you. My final question is to you, Mr. Nelson. Yesterday, a number was floated about $14.9 million, and it was my understanding that that was your estimation of the approximate funding you would need to implement effective enforcement.
The actual number of 14.9 that I mentioned yesterday was the gap that would bring Pacific region up to the average of 56% of the Ecosystems and Fisheries Management Organization. In other words, we had about 30%, the average of the other three was 56. The gap was 14.9 million. Through my own prior process to that, I calculated what some funding pressures, existing funding pressures, plus some additional resources we would need to bring us up, and it came out to roughly the same number. I think I said 12 to 14 million.
Did that estimate incorporate a recommitment to enforcing habitat violations, or did it not include that?
I'd have to check. I don't believe so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Anya Brown, and with me is Leah Pence, and we're counsel for the First Nations Coalition. The First Nations Coalition represents some of the First Nations along the Fraser River, some Fraser River First Nations fishing organizations, as well as the Council of Haida Nation and some of the Douglas Treaty First Nations. My first series of questions will be directed at you, Mr. Koltish.
Sorry, I just one question in relation to the one that was just asked. I just checked and I was mistaken. It did include, my estimates of that 15 million did include 17 fisher officers for dealing with habitat issues in northeast and southeast BC. So something was ringing a bell, and that's what it was.
So, Mr. Koltish, I'd like to start out by asking you a series of questions in relation to Project Ice Storm, and we've heard quite a bit of evidence about that yesterday and as well as today. And then, as we've heard, it was a 2005 investigation and an audit that was done on cold storage facilities in the Lower Mainland involving 1.9 million salmon that were stored by various First Nations individuals and some companies. And we see from Exhibit 868, and I won't take you to that, but the number that we're given there is that it was an estimated 1.9 million pounds, which was attributed to about 345,000 pieces. If we could please have Exhibit 870, Mr. Lunn, Operational Intelligence Assessment. And I simply note at page 5 where the aim is set out, it says to conduct a physical audit of the 2005 salmon harvest season of cold storage fish plants. And then at page 7, there's a heading that says limitations and delimitations to the report. So it indicates there the project will only focus on salmon, and that the project is limited to all salmon caught between the time periods of April 1st, 2005 to the present, which would have been the writing of the report. So the audit was not specific to sockeye salmon, correct?
That's what's written, yes.
Right, and it wasn't specific to salmon that was necessarily caught on the Lower Fraser.
That's correct.
Right. Isn't it also the case that cold storage records don't typically require the owner of the salmon to indicate where the fish was caught?
That's correct.
All right. And so it was only an assumption that the fish was caught on the Fraser River, correct?
At the time, there were subsequent sampling taken for DNA from, as I understand, many of the locations to determine source of the product. And in fact, this showed that these were Fraser River fish.
So when you say from many of the locations, are you referring to the list that we saw, which was Exhibit 869, where there was a list with a big chunk of information redacted? Is that where you're indicating the samples were taken from?
Yes, I clarify, I was not personally involved nor supervised this particular project. I've assumed the group that had, and as my information is that DNA sampling was taken from the facilities of this product to determine source, and of that, the estimate of the 1.9 million salmon, pounds, was confirmed to be Fraser River caught salmon.
If you were to look at Exhibit 869, I'm not asking you to turn it up, Mr. Lunn, at this point, unless Mr. Koldish is able to answer. Are you able to answer with certainty how many of the entries on Exhibit 869 were attributable to Lower Fraser sockeye salmon?
I personally can't. That information may be available from the people that were involved in the investigation, and I may be able to determine that, but I personally don't have that. No.
All right, so all we know is some, but not all.
Again, I can't say that for sure. What I have been told again through, is that the product that has been identified is Fraser River salmon.
And are you saying that the 1.9 million pounds were identified as Fraser River salmon, or that the audit
No.
was for 1.9 million pounds of salmon, and it's not possible to say where all that salmon originated from?
I believe, to be accurate, that the 1.9 million pounds of salmon was determined to be harvested, FSC harvested in the Fraser River.
Now, you noted yesterday, and it's also confirmed in the documents that have been entered in exhibits as in respect of Project Ice Storm, that notwithstanding the department's suspicions, no offenses with respect to sale of that fish that was audited had occurred.
The project was primarily determining the quantity of product of FSC held in storage.
Right.
It wasn't to determine sale at that time. It was more or less to, as you say, an audit.
Right. And we heard evidence yesterday about the various ways that some of the fish that was examined in the course of the audit had been processed. Some of it had been glazed and fast frozen, for example. And I think you indicated in your evidence yesterday that this is one of the best methods to preserve the shelf life of frozen fish. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And would you agree that another one of the very effective ways to protect fish from freezer burn and to maintain its shelf life is to vacuum pack it?
Yes, that's a method of protecting fish, yes.
You noted that some of the fish had been smoked, but you don't know, or the audit didn't reveal whether the fish had been smoked commercially in a commercial facility or whether it had been smoked in a smokehouse or by the particular individual holding the fish, correct?
That's correct. And in fact, that's one of the primary concerns, is that if the fish, or this fish that had been processed, that is smoked, if it was simply FSC fish and to be used for personal consumption, then there's no regulations on how that's done. However, if it was intended to be sold, then that constituted a violation under provincial legislation and posed serious health threats.
Right, if it was going to be sold, but there was no evidence gathered in the course of the audit that indicated anything illegal was happening. This was simply fish that was being stored in a cold storage facility.
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Coltish, do you have any personal knowledge of First Nations ceremonial use of fish and the extent to which food fish is used?
I've extensive experience working with First Nations, attending ceremonies myself on numerous occasions for the nearly 29 years of my experience, my career.
All right, then would you agree with me that fish, in particular salmon, is a very important part of First Nations ceremonies?
Very much so.
Right. And do you also agree that it makes sense for First Nations people to want to preserve the fish that they catch and use for ceremonial and food and social purposes to ensure the best quality for the longest period of time?
I would agree. I'll also add that it's been my experience living in and working around communities, First Nations communities, where most of the product that they utilize, or most of the fish they utilize for ceremonial purposes, is generally processed themselves through smoking, canning, preserving, drying, and so on. There's no cost to this other than what they bear themselves. There's no question that salmon is culturally integral to our First Nations communities, and as I said, I've been to many such ceremonies where that's the case. But it's my experience that the majority of this fish in that way, if preserved and to be kept for a longer period of time, are generally done within the community. And there's, in many cases, set people elders and so on who do this because they've done this for many, many years, and they know the way, the culturally historical ways of doing this, because a lot of these ceremonies, the fish is handled and preserved or prepared and served in historic cultural manners, such that the idea of having large quantities of this fish preserved in a method typically seen as commercial product, packaged in the same ways that you would see commercial product, housed in the same locations, costing money to do so, to me is an anomaly when it comes to that type of process.
Getting back to freezing as a way of preserving fish, it's certainly obvious to all of us that one can't preserve frozen fish indefinitely. It has a shelf life, and at some point, whether it's vacuum packed or frozen in some other way, eventually you can't use the fish anymore. So I suggest to you, it's not surprising that in June of 2006, 60 or 70% of the fish would have been removed.
Again, I can't question that 60-70% of the fish were removed. In fact, they were. The issue is we don't know what occurred with those fish, whether they in fact were clearly FSC and consumed, or a portion of that was sold. Our belief is, given the nature and the processing, the handling, the locations, and others, and the people involved who owned this fish, that a substantial quantity, if not all, was sold.
But you don't know that. There's no
That's
evidence
correct.
to show that.
We have not obtained the evidence to prosecute. You're correct.
Isn't it also equally possible that, assuming that was food, social, and ceremonial fish, that in the months that transpired from April 1, 2005 until June 2006, that fish was removed from time to time to time by the owners and used for food, social, and ceremonial purposes?
That could have occurred, yes.
And you don't have any evidence to suggest otherwise, correct?
That's correct.
And indeed,
I was just going to add a comment, something that Mr. Koltish said yesterday about there being company names and the fish being changed hands. This is all about probabilities, and if you look at it, what's reasonable to assume? Is it reasonable to assume that several 100,000 pieces of salmon were put in cold storage, fairly large costs incurred to store them, and company names being put on them, names changing, fish moving from plant to plant, and all kinds of things happening? And is it possible that it all was consumed? I would say it is, as FSC, I would say it's remotely possible. It's much more conceivable and likely that this large amount of this fish entered the commercial market.
I'll also add that prior to that ice storm investigation, there was another investigation that was conducted where we found same individuals as what was encountered in the next year in ice storm, but individuals who are First Nations members bringing product into a commercial processing facility, cold storage, and no documentation of this product was held, kept, and in fact the person, the owner of that facility, was charged through the province. These same people, product was found in ice storm, same individuals, companies associated to them, large quantities. So again, we did not prosecute anybody from ice storm, but we have very strong information and what we would believe that these same individuals, as well as others, were bringing this fish in much of it, if not all of it, at a price. And the question is then very clearly, could have all of that product, that amount, have been consumed in that period of time, or could it have been sold?
Well, that's really the critical question, isn't it? And unfortunately, we don't have a member of a First Nations community on this panel to address that very question. However, we have the exhibits and we have your evidence. Exhibit 869, my colleague has just tallied it up, and the owners of the product that was subject to the audit tally up to 49 individuals and companies. Do you know if any of the product was held in the name of particular First Nations?
I personally don't. I have to go back to the original file and have a look at that.
All right. Are you aware that some First Nations process and hold large amounts of fish on behalf of their members, in particular elders and widows and other people who aren't able to obtain fish for themselves?
I wouldn't be surprised that that occurs.
Right, and we have no evidence to the contrary, correct?
No, that's right.
In terms of the fish, again, the fish being largely gone by June, isn't that something that's that one would expect, given that in June, the holders of this fish have the opportunity to go out fishing and to obtain a fresh supply of food, social, and ceremonial use? There's no point in keeping it much longer than that.
I can't make those assumptions, I'm sorry. That may be a reasonable explanation. I can't assume that. That may be very valid.
Right, but I think you agreed earlier that fish degrades the longer it's been frozen, correct?
Well, for that product that is handled in that manner, product that has been canned or vacuum packed and frozen, I'm not an expert in shelf life, but that can be held longer than just even just glazed fish.
Right. And would you also agree that fresh fish is preferable to frozen fish?
Absolutely.
Now, you're not aware of any cold storage facilities that are located on reserves in the Lower Mainland at this time, are you?
I'm not aware of any commercial operations, no.
Right. So any Aboriginal person or a First Nation that wants to freeze or store their fish and isn't able to do so at home, and that may have to do simply with the freezing capacity if one has a large amount of food, social, and ceremonial fish. Wouldn't it make sense then to utilize the services of a cold storage facility to do that?
That may be very true. It's been my experience that most or a great deal of FSC fish is processed in a manner that is not left in a glazed manner. It's either smoked, dried, canned, pickled. It's been my experience that for in-season use, they'll keep it that way. They'll glaze it, or they'll keep it in that type of condition. But if it's going to be longer term, i.e., over the winter and so on, in most cases, it's dealt with as I've described, rather than glazed in that manner.
Now, Mr. Nelson, I have some questions for you. You indicated in your evidence yesterday that the Pacific region, and this was in response to questions, not in respect of Project Ice Storm. It was a response to later on in the day in respect of the challenges that you had in doing the work that you need to do. And if I heard your evidence correctly, you had noted that in the Pacific region, there are more bands and First Nations than any other region in Canada, correct?
Yes.
And are you able to say with any degree of certainty how many First Nations there are in BC?
I should have that number. I know there are close to 200 bands, and I'm not sure the number.
Okay. And my client advises me that there are 97 Indian bands along the Fraser River, and of that, there are 36 bands on the Lower Fraser. Do you agree with that number, or does it sound generally accurate to you?
It's close. I've heard numbers from 92 to 97. It's in that range, yes.
Right. And without getting into any specifics, would you agree that that reasonably represents thousands of Aboriginal people?
Yes.
Some of the bands are small, some of them are quite large, and we have instances where people are living on reserve and off reserve.
Yes.
All right. My next question is really to both of you, and I simply want to confirm, is it correct that the department has no data on the extent of the use of food, social, and ceremonial salmon?
I'm sorry, you say no data on the use?
Is it correct that you currently don't have any data that shows the extent of food, social, and ceremonial use of salmon by First Nations along the Fraser River, to be specific?
I believe there is some information, but I don't have it.
All right.
One of the important points I think that is that in the past, the department, I've personally been involved in this, where we've actually approached First Nations groups asking them to quantify to us how many fish, for instance, each individual or each family would utilize throughout the year as part of their food, social, ceremonial use, to give us an idea when it came down to things like allocations. We have simply never been provided that information. So it's very difficult for us to make any assumptions that an average First Nation person would consume 200 pieces a year. Simply put, they've refused to give us that information as part of our management practices of the fishery. So we understand that salmon on the Fraser River is a cultural integral part of the culture. But we've never been given the information to quantify what they believe is what they require.
Right. And you've indicated that you've attended some ceremonies that have been hosted by First Nations, and Mr. Nelson has also provided evidence of attending ceremonies. And if I recall your evidence correctly, Mr. Nelson, did you indicate that you were personally part of the pulling together canoe journeys?
I have participated in one of them, yes.
Right, and so you would have traveled from First Nations community to community and being
Yes.
hosted there.
Yes.
And I expect that you would have been feasted and probably served salmon prepared in a variety of ways, correct?
In some of those, but I didn't encounter any of the fish that were processed or packaged in commercial product. In one area, sorry, I should say that in one band that I have gone to, they did have vacuum packed. It looked like commercially packaged sockeye salmon, and this is on the Fraser River. But embedded in the plastic was the words "not for sale," and I really complimented on that method of packaging because clearly that identified it as FSC. That band chose to market themselves. But I have not encountered any commercially processed product at those feasts. Did they take it out of packaging, or it did? I've never seen any fish other than that appeared to me to be commercially processed at feasts that I've been involved in.
Right, my question really is more to your personal experience in having been hosted in First Nations communities and experienced salmon as a food source that was served to you and the other
Yes.
guests there.
Yes.
And
Not just salmon, but shellfish, crab.
right,
Yeah.
all sorts of traditional foods and probably non-traditional foods as well.
Yes.
All right. And my client advises me that in the course of longhouse ceremonies on the Lower Fraser that may take place over a series of many months through the course of exchanging food for potlatches that may be taking place in other areas of the coast, that there's intertribal trade, that there's salmon served at funerals and weddings, and that at times anywhere from hundreds to thousands of people can be served salmon. Salmon is also typically served, I'm advised, at meetings and the sorts of events that Mr. Nelson testified to yesterday and that were highlighted in Exhibit 880. So in the meetings and in the first salmon ceremonies that were that we heard of in respect of the Tawasin First Nation. So salmon is an important food source, and I think you both agree to that, but we've heard Mr. Kultish say that you don't have information with respect to the numbers.
Yes.
But you both
I'm
agree.
just going to interrupt my friend. There was an awfully long, what started to sound like a submission. I'm not sure if there's a question arising from those propositions.
The question really is that given the extent of food, social, and ceremonial use, and the fact that we are looking at an area here that encompasses thousands of Aboriginal people, what I'm putting to you is that it would be safe to assume that the fish that was captured by the audit was used for food, social, and ceremonial use.
In my view, it wouldn't be safe to assume that. It would be a possibility, and I would view it as a remote one, that a large percentage of that fish was consumed as FSC based on the information provided, the packaging. You mentioned about stream bands in the interior. I've never encountered, worked in the interior for 25 years. I've never encountered or heard of bands storing any of their fish, FSC fish, in cold storage. We have followed and tracked some that went for legal sale and ended up in cold storage, but I don't know of any bans. If they are, there's not very much of it.
And you've not asked that question, have you?
No.
And I'd like to add a couple of points. 3 years ago, when I was still the chief of the North Coast, the Okanagan bands organized a canoe journey. And as part of that canoe journey, there were a number of our officers in the Pacific region that attended. In fact, I believe Randy may have attended that as well. It was held in Penticton. As part of the feast, because we had a canoe, the department was required to provide fish. And in doing so with the First Nations, they indicated that they didn't have sufficient quantities of salmon, fresh salmon or salmon, to be able to handle that feast. Hence, in fact, I went up to a supplier, a commercial supplier in Prince Rupert, because this was in early July, and bought 150 pounds of sockeye salmon to have at that feast. Second of all, the point that you raised with regards to First Nations, as part of the one of the avenues that the department supplies First Nations or permits, because all fisheries must be licensed, is what's referred to as a ceremonial license. And this is where somebody in the community or the community requires fish for communal for ceremonial purposes. Could be a funeral, could be a wedding, could be a tournament, a gathering. Licenses are issued by the department for that, for an individual or a group of individuals to harvest fish for that ceremony. And there are lots and lots of those permits or licenses issued. I can't speak to the number that was issued last year or 2 years ago, but I'm certainly familiar that there are many, many of those. So that gives the First Nations the ability that whenever there is fish in the river, from the time the Chinook begin to enter until the last fish is, they can harvest. There is a quota attached to that. They are then able to harvest and utilize that fish. So the First Nations that I'm aware, particularly on the Fraser, but in our part of the country, Lower Fraser, and up and through to the Hopenat area, Stalo and so on, utilize this for many, many of their ceremonies throughout the year, throughout the time that fish is in. So the need to stockpile large volumes of fish is not required during that time. It would be the winter months that they may be doing that. But then again, that's what these ceremonial licenses also provide some avenue for.
Ms. Brown, I note the time. How much longer are you going to be?
Well, we've been allotted an hour, Mr. Commissioner, so I expect to stick closely to my time estimate, and I'll be another half hour after we resume.
Right, is it convenient then to resume at 2 o'clock?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, just so you know, that there may be some brief re-exam by Canada and myself, but Ms. Brown and Mr. Dixon and Ms. Sharp have agreed to sort out amongst themselves how to divide the rest of the time, and I'm certainly content for them to do that.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.